This is an attempt by the Conservatives to break down the system of representation and protection of workers' rights in Canada. It will, of course, be defeated by the courts, but in the meantime, it'll require a lot of bureaucracy. So for a government that says it's against red tape, this is just a mountain of red tape that they're throwing out there. It will be thrown down by the courts. I have no doubt about that.
Jerry Agar for Ezra Levant. Now that Michigan is moving toward designating itself a right-to-work state, is Canada next? Could it work in Canada? And what about requiring unions to be a little more transparent? Thomas Mulcair doesn't seem to think any of that will work. John Mortimer is the president of the Canadian Labour Watch Association. John, welcome.
Good to be here.
You know, let's go back to that clip we just saw and heard from Thomas Mulcair. He thinks the courts would throw out the idea of demanding that unions be transparent. I'm not exactly sure what part of the charter he's talking about.
Yeah, you know, the Canadian Bar Association and the Privacy Commissioner of Canada both said things about Bill C-377 that can't be backed up in law. And Canadian Labour Congress and the AFL-CIO Building Trades Department, they're just running this stuff from the Canadian Bar Association. I mean, Jerry, as a group of lawyers, how do you say that something's illegal without naming a single statute, not citing a single court ruling, or naming a section of the charter? It's outrageous.
Well, I think what people try to push here is the right to assemble, but I don't know that we've ever gone to the Supreme Court with a case that said the right not to assemble.
No, the Supreme Court has ruled twice on the issue of freedom of association when it comes to unions. They have ruled 8-1. There is a charter freedom to not associate in Section 2D.
Okay.
And then this whole notion of non-association has been affirmed outside of the area of unions in like an egg marketing case. And so the case law has evolved further. And I believe that this will be the foundation for Canada to join the rest of the civilized world and protect working Canadians and protect all Canadians from inappropriate big labor leader powers. You know, nowhere else in the world can you be fired for not becoming a member of the union. Nowhere else can you be fired for not paying for the political views of a union leader, except Canada. It's time for change.
Well, and some states in the United States, but more and more of them, as we see happening in Michigan, are making these changes, and that's going to panic, I think, not only the unions, but it's something of concern for Canadians, because I see the concern that if Michigan now becomes a right-to-work state, you don't have to join a union. Maybe the auto companies would decide they don't need to be in Windsor.
Yeah, well, let's understand something. What right-to-work means at its core is the right not to have to pay union dues in order to get or keep a job. They equate in the notion of right to work the idea that paying union dues is akin to becoming a member. But the U.S. Supreme Court long ago outlined forced union membership for workers at the Big Three. The issue is the compulsion to pay union dues in a state like Michigan. And that's come to an end. You know, I think it's been over 20 or 30 years since two states in America moved to protect its workers with choice on union dues in the same year. And this year it's Indiana and Michigan, two deindustrializing Rust Belt states that are joining Europe in reforming and joining other American states that made this move years ago. And this will be great for everybody because it will be economically beneficial in the long term. Workers will be happier and more engaged if union leaders have to be accountable to people that choose to pay them rather than must pay them.
Well, accountable in that way, and then to come back to the Canadian bill going through in Ottawa, it goes to the Senate next, I guess, is the accountability the unions would have to have, just as charities do in Canada, where they would have to show their books. They're a non-tax-paying entity, and so they would have to demonstrate their fiscal responsibility and where they're spending the money. That would be of benefit to union members. And in the United States, when states made that same move, an awful lot of convictions were achieved against union leaders.
Well, actually, the head of the American labor movement in the 1950s, George Meany, and the Democrats, led by none other than, Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy himself, led the American regime into forced union disclosure. And it has only been strengthened since 1959, and it's been good for America, and it's been good for unions. But yes, almost 1,000 people were convicted last decade of basically fraud-oriented violations of U.S. law. And so we're going to see Whether this bill passes the House of Commons tonight, nobody knows. The opposition will probably whip their caucus against it. I think you'll see the Conservatives free vote. I do believe you will see some Conservatives vote against it. The question is, with the union occupations of riding offices, old-time union, violent, intimidating, bullying tactics, have they pushed enough Conservatives to vote no to defeat the bill? That's what we're going to find out tonight. Why has Harper decided to go on a free vote? I think that, you know, notwithstanding all the rhetoric of the opposition, which they can't back up, they're the ones who are probably going to be pushing their people to vote against it. It's who he is. And all these other claims that the left-leaning media makes are simply not true, and Canadians are going to see that tonight. The question is, will the Toronto Star report that, or will they spin it? Well, it may depend, of course, how the vote comes out as to how they will handle that. But if it is, in fact, successful there, what about with the Senate? Well, you know, I think that we'll find that there's going to be broad support for transparency. You know, if countries like France can have unions ask for union disclosure and pass it just in the last 4 or 5 years, why can't Canada? It's a very compelling argument. It's difficult to stand against. 86% of unionized Canadians support financial disclosure. Yet, Jerry, every one of their union leaders is here on the forced dime of those people opposing what they want, to know what's going on and make sure Canadians can know what's going on. And you know what I think we're also going to find if this bill passes? We're going to find that maybe $1 billion in dues that are being deducted at the expense of the taxpayer are not lawfully being deducted under the Income Tax Act as it's drafted today. It already has a provision that says when union dues are not deductible. And there's all sorts of things that Canadian unions are doing that are not okay under the Income Tax Act. But there's no information that the CRA has, or the Canadian Taxpayers Federation have, or Labour Watch has, in order to hold parliamentarians and bureaucrats accountable to enforce the law as drafted decades ago. Well, it may be an interesting discussion tomorrow then after the vote. Thank you very much for this. I look forward to it. Take care. All right.